This, I think, sets the tone for the panel and for the rest of the meetings today and tomorrow. Kamal, would you like to introduce Dr. Alice Hill?
Yes, Dr. Alice Hill will comment on what Professor Jim Hall just presented. I think the three strands that you talked about, the asset level resilience, the resilience of networks, and your sustainable infrastructure development planning. In the disaster risk reduction community, traditionally, we have made some progress on the first one. I think second one we know very little about and practice even less. And the third one is a much broader challenge of mainstreaming that we've been trying to address with very limited success. With that, we turn over to Dr. Alice Hill. She's from the Hoover Institution, Stanford. She has advised President Obama on climate resilience issues within the larger security framework for the United States. She is a champion of the cause of building capacities for dealing with uncertainties in infrastructure development, has been at the leading edge of some advocacy work on this, and there's a report that's just coming out which she'll hopefully talk about.
Thank you so much, Kamal, and my esteemed panelists. It's truly my honor and pleasure to be here with you. I come from the United States. You might have heard that we've had unusual past 2 years that have challenged us. The challenges that you may have heard of are not the ones that I have in mind, not our political challenges, but in fact the impact of natural disasters. Last year, we saw wildfires in California on an unprecedented level, the most costly natural disasters in the world for that year. The year before that, we had 3 hurricanes pummel our shores, and again, those were the most expensive natural disasters in the United States history. When natural disasters occur to countries at such extreme levels, commonly, in my observation, communities experience a no more moment. A moment where they vow this will not happen again. We've been talking about infrastructure systems. For the United States, that moment occurred when Superstorm Sandy hit Manhattan, New York City, at high tide, at a time that caused the city that never sleeps to plunge into utter darkness. And that was the time the United States saw that once the electric grid fails, it pulls down all the other sectors involved. Transportation failed, communication failed, emergency management failed, our healthcare system failed. It was a wake-up call for us and certainly for the New York region. They have done remarkable work in looking at systems to make sure that they are resilient. Along with their progress, we have seen, as Dr. Hall alluded to, real growth in data and our ability to understand that data, to map it using GIS mapping so that we can visualize the risks for our communities. They can understand what will be underwater, what is at risk of being out of power. We also have been able to combine artificial intelligence with sensors that allow, as the article was showed with earthquakes, can within 15 minutes identify what infrastructure structures are down and will not be functioning, what streets are blocked after a seismic event. So tremendous progress being made, but you've heard that as the rest of the world, the United States will be making investments in infrastructure going forward. Much of that will be investing in existing infrastructure to retrofit it, but also new infrastructure. And the challenge for us is the same challenge that we've discussed here. We can screen each of those assets for climate resilience, and we need to do that. But we need to move that upstream, as we've heard mentioned, so that we're screening systematically and can understand what a sandy storm or a wildfire can do to pull down your entire infrastructure system. All of that comes at tremendous cost, not only, as we've heard, to the assets themselves, but also to the local economies if we cannot get back up and running. We also need to learn the hard lesson of where we build matters. We have a little bit of regulation in this area where we try to preclude investment in floodplains. But you will see the United States in the coming months and years deeply challenged with wildfire, and our decisions about where to allow building to occur when there is an increasing risk of wildfire across the western United States and the southeastern. But telling people they can't live in an area that is not at sea level rise risk, it's just risk of burning, who knows when, it's similar to seismic risk. Very challenging for us, and we have not found the solutions. The fabulous thing for me to have a chance to be here today is that these global problems are going to require local solutions, and those local solutions will be developed in communities across the world. And this gives me and others an opportunity to learn about the solutions and ideas that others have already reached. We'll need to do a massive amount of sharing, and as one speaker said, capacity building. It's simply not understood, at least in the United States yet, the engineering challenges that are involved, the land use challenges that are involved, the emergency management challenges that are involved. Those communities do not yet incorporate and account for the risks that we've discussed here, nor do they look at it in a systematic level. So to the extent that others have cracked that nut, so to speak, and determined how best to build capacity across communities, I hope that I can learn from you and we can all share together to do the very important job of ensuring that our infrastructure is in fact disaster resilient. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. What can I say in introduction to Andrew Maskrey? Andrew Maskrey runs an initiative called Risk Nexus Initiative, has worked for over 4 decades on disaster risk management issues, has done leading edge work on global risk assessments, led the development of 5 or 6 global assessment reports, including the first one which came out in 2004. And now working with institutions of Global South to work together in developing systems for better understanding and management of risks. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Kamal. And again, I'd like to sincerely thank NDMA, the Indian government, and other organizers for the privilege of being able to address you today. I'm going to really make 4 points. 2 points as to why I think this coalition is so important and why it has the level of responsibility it has is so great. And then I'd just like to mention two areas where I really think we need to focus on in terms of looking at solutions to the infrastructure challenge, which Professor Hall, I think, so eloquently presented in his keynote. In terms of why this coalition is so important, the last time we calculated what's called average annual loss for the world's built environment, which is work we did for the UN up until 2017, the AAL, that average annual loss, came to around $300 billion, just for what we call the intensive risk events, larger earthquakes, floods, tropical cyclones, tsunamis, etc. If we added onto that what is the likely average annual loss from extensive risk, which is all the small-scale, frequent risks associated with landslides, wildfires, flash flooding, surface flooding, etc., at a sort of guesstimate, that would probably add around another 30% on. So we're talking around a world of around $400 billion on 2015 figures. If we assume that between 2015 and 2019, the world has become even more risky, which it must have done due to increased exposure, climate change and other factors, we're probably not far off now a $500 billion average annual loss, just in terms of the direct losses to the built environment, yeah? Again, I'm going to continue extrapolating here, but I think all these studies which have been done on the relationship between direct losses, so that's asset loss, to indirect losses, so those are the economic flows that are affected by those asset losses, show a ratio of approximately 1 to 1.5, which would mean we're somewhere in the region of a 750 billion annual average indirect loss now. If we assume that global GDP growth in 2019 is estimated to be around 2.7 trillion, it means we're fairly close now to a world where indirect losses from disasters are approaching around 30% of our expected GDP growth, yeah? So I think that's a fairly serious starting point to take for our discussion. I'll say it up front, I published a book in the early 80s called Disasters Aren't Natural, and I still don't like the use of the word natural disasters because they're not. If we start off from the viewpoint that any development investment can either increase or decrease risks, and we look at the trillions of dollars of potential infrastructure investment which Professor Hall mentioned, then we do actually have a choice. We have a choice as to whether risk increases, I would say, exponentially through to 2030, or if we get it right and we can make that investment resilient, whether the risk can actually stabilize and go down. So the first point I would just like to make is I think this coalition has an enormous responsibility on its hands in terms of achieving the global targets which countries came together to negotiate in terms of a Sendai framework, particularly in terms of reducing the economic loss and reducing damage and interruption to critical infrastructure and services. If this coalition can get it right, those gigantic risk figures may stabilize and go down, and if it doesn't, I think they will certainly go up. The second reason for which this coalition is so important, I think, is, and again, this was mentioned by Professor Hall, is the achievement of the SDGs. And again, the sort of, let's say, the global risk metrics can tell us a lot about this relationship. If we compare country by country, the average annual loss we would expect in the built environment to what countries are currently investing in infrastructure, let's say their capital investment. In those countries where the average annual loss represents a very high percentage of capital investment as it is now, countries will not in the long term be able to either sustain or increase that investment, yeah? And we're being told that they need to sustain or increase that investment to achieve the SDGs. And this is not true just for the infrastructure SDGs. Again, as we heard from Professor Hall, achieving sustainable infrastructure really spreads across a wide range of the SDGs. So again, if we don't actually, decrease the risk and increase the resilience and really knock at that ratio of risk to capital investment, we're not going to achieve the SDGs either. So a second reason why this coalition is so important. Now, in terms of Two areas I'd like just to mention where I really believe the coalition can make a difference in terms of finding solutions to this. And the two which I don't think have been mentioned in the previous interventions. We can divide, obviously, infrastructure into sectors, transport, energy, water, and so on and so forth, and we can look at different kinds of infrastructure. But I'd just like you to think about infrastructure in two ways. One is, in a sense, what we could call strategic infrastructure, which is necessary for the integration of national, regional, and indeed the global economy. Deep sea ports, major airports, major transportation corridors, major energy distribution networks, and what we might call local infrastructure, which is, in a sense, what is basically managed by local utility companies, local governments. So we're talking here about local road networks, sanitation systems, water systems, power distribution, etc. And I think both represent quite different challenges for the coalition as we go forward. They're not obviously completely separate categories in the sense that obviously local infrastructure is somehow linked into and connected to the strategic infrastructure, but they do represent different challenges. In terms of the strategic infrastructure, again, having a set of comparable, consistent risk metrics across the world's countries and territories, and having the sort of information which Professor Hall in his presentation showed us on the exposure and risk different infrastructure classes can potentially help to actually change the direction of investment flows. We do need the trillions of dollars of investment that are going to start flowing or already flowing to start actually flowing into resilient infrastructure and not into the non-resilient infrastructure. But I think those metrics in themselves aren't enough. There's always the danger there that the investment only flows to the countries which have got the lower risks. And many of the higher risk countries are the countries which are actually going to need to invest more. So we need to find other metrics which can actually provide incentives to countries that are actually doing the most to reduce their risk and to increase their resilience. So I'd like to put on the table three ideas here. One idea is we need to really come up through the coalition with resilient infrastructure standards, an accepted resilient infrastructure standard. We need to come up as well with independent third-party certification measures which can actually tell us whether countries are achieving those standards or not. And out of that, we can perhaps start generating, this is maybe still a bit further down the road, but I would like to think we could start generating something that in the markets we could call a resilient infrastructure class of assets, which could actually encourage the trillions of dollars of finance, it'd actually give it a target for flowing into resilient infrastructure. So in terms of the strategic infrastructure segment, this I think can be something we need to consider. But we also need to consider, and again, I think this is critically important when we go back to the SDGs, the local infrastructure segment. Because most people around the world, I would say all of us in fact, depend on local infrastructure one way or another. And the local infrastructure segment has a completely different range of challenges. We've seen over the years in many countries, but even when we get disaster risk management and resilience fully embedded into national policies, national strategies, and national legislation, the process through which that gets transmitted down to the local government and community level is not straightforward. So we often find situations in which, looking at what's on paper in the law books, everything looks superb. When you actually go down to the local governments and communities, it's really business as usual, and things are not being built to resilient standards. Many local governments in developing countries don't even have trained engineers, let alone engineers who know about resilience and resilient infrastructure. So the second challenge I'd like to put on the table for the coalition is really looking, it's a soft challenge rather than a hard challenge, which is really at the governance issue related to this, and particularly how can we strengthen local, in Latin America we certainly refer to it as territorial governance. And I do believe that, I mean, strengthening territorial governance is key in three ways again. One way is actually to do the planning of local infrastructure in terms of the planning of a territory. So it actually meets people's needs, is cost effective and resilient. We need to also link this into how public investment is made as well. If we have public investment in a sense de-linked, which is often managed by finance and planning ministries, de-linked from the sort of territorial planning side, again, we're not going to get the resilience. And last but not least, we need to have, you know, stronger regulation at the local level to actually ensure that standards are fulfilled. Because often we have issues of what I might describe as political moral hazard at the local level, where local authorities, in the rush to be able to spend their budget and generate enough infrastructure which can get them re-elected, the incentive to actually build more infrastructure to a lower standard is often higher politically than the incentive to build less infrastructure to a higher standard. So we need to also look at the politics of this and how, in a sense, the political economy of resilient infrastructure. So those are the 4 points I'd like to lay on the table. 2 reasons why I think the coalition is so important and has such a great responsibility, and 2 ideas to put on the table in terms of our future work. So thank you, Kamal, again.
Thank you, Andrew. Very interesting ideas for action in the future, division between strategic and local infrastructure, the idea of developing matrix to incentivize investment in resilient infrastructure even in high-risk environment. With that, we turn over to Rowan Douglas. He works for the insurance segment. I was hesitating to call it industry because I remember the last time we met 5 months ago in Finance Commission workshop, you said that insurance is not an industry, it's an institution of society. I think that's a good enough introduction for you.
Kamal, thank you very much indeed. And I think I'm the last panelist, and then we come to the audience for questions, and so get ready. I really just want to sort of wrap up the panels, the panel interventions with a couple of observations to pick up on where I think the Commission is so well timed and could make such a big difference. Although I must say, Andrew Maskrey has stolen my thunder. I agree with everything Andrew said about some priorities. And then perhaps finish with I guess a vision for what this Commission should do and the challenge we face. So first, some observations. The first is that I was lucky enough to chair the private sector committee that sort of provided input into the Sendai Agreement. And I was there in Sendai in 2015. And then was lucky enough to be part of the other processes later in the year. And I would describe Sendai and the SDGs as a whole, actually, but particularly Sendai as being a bit of a slow burn. It was sort of born in 2015, and perhaps it's been nurtured in its infancy in a nursery somewhere, but suddenly now it's beginning to walk. And just the last 5 months has been quite instructive. Kamal just mentioned I was lucky enough to be here in Delhi in November at a meeting organised by the NDRI and the 5th Finance Commission under the chairmanship of Dr. Singh. And I think it was probably the first time that disaster resilience and related financing here in India was a key part of one of the 5-year Finance Commissions. So that was sort of item number 1. Where should we go to next? Davos, January. I'm wearing my Davos WEF pins, SDGs, Goal 17. I'm lucky enough to go to Davos most years. Absolutely for the first time that sustainable development, resilience, climate, all these things have moved into the center of the discussion. It's absolutely fundamental. And so much of that is wrapped around the infrastructure theme, because infrastructure is where it all comes together. Growth, resilience, investment. Third, actually, was with Mami Mazaturi at the Bank of England. Just a month ago, UNICR teamed up with the Insurance Development Forum and Governor Mark Carney hosted a meeting on how are we going to mobilize the insurance industry to use its great investment resources to build infrastructure in developing and emerging countries, and specifically climate and disaster resilient infrastructure. And now we're here today, and Jim set the scene with some of the wider processes. But this sort of gathering, this sort of mainstreaming, would simply not have happened even 3 years ago. And that's why this commission, this coalition, is formed at just the right time. And what's exciting to me is it brings together an intellectual fusion and an institutional fusion that has not happened before, much to many of our frustration, and that is this. It's bringing together a disaster risk reduction community, now rebranded Resilience, which knows about risk. But until now, it's been a relatively specialist group that hasn't had the wider impact that it deserves. And I can say this also as an insurance risk monger, I feel much the same. Meanwhile, the great juggernaut of the climate community, which has fundamentally been around understanding the hazard, but not how that moves into the risk, and the issues of mitigation and counting carbon, are realizing that to deal with adaptation and resilience, you need a different set of skills. And it's actually the issue of resilient infrastructure that is bringing these two communities, which have been too far apart for 10 years or more, together in a remarkable fusion. I'm not going to speak for much longer because I know we've got to go to the audience. In terms of what the Commission has done, I think the panel, and I must say the opening statements this morning, I thought was spot on. And the fact we've got such senior leaders being so on the mark of what's needed around governance, data, is exciting. I think Andrew had completely the key points to me around risk metrics, risk analytics, and if we have a collective challenge, I struggle that the amount of money required to provide basic risk provision and information around the world is relatively peanuts. We're talking not even hundreds of millions of dollars. It's actually less than that to build on the great work done by GAR, for example. And yet it's difficult at national and global levels to mobilize this vital work that isn't actually to invent anything new, it's simply to mobilize the knowledge we already have. And I think that's a huge challenge that this commission around infrastructure should be a focal point. And if we can mobilize that support, that would be key. But finally, if I can have one more minute, Kamal. You're giving me that look, Kamal. It means, can I end with a vision? Because we've done all this before as a society. This is not new. The 19th century, late 19th century, the 1870s, the climate change disaster risk issue of the era was urban fire and conflagration. Cities around the world, but particularly in the US and Europe, were burning because they'd been built to burn. Growth had happened, but no one had been concerned about fire because it was just one of those things. But ultimately, the losses were becoming so large and so frequent that that ultimately investors, business decided the losses were just too great to deal with. Never mind the human tragedy, and that something had to be done. And they said, well, you know, we need insurance. And ultimately, the insurers came back. This was in America, and they came back a few years later and said, well, you can have your insurance, but you need a whole load of other things to actually make the pot of capital, the community pot of capital that is all insurance is, resilient. They didn't use the word resilient, they probably said something else. But they said you've got to have zoning laws, you've got to have building codes, you've got to have a fire department every 2 or 3 miles, You've actually got to have standards of insurance and actually reinsurance around the world so we can all share this risk. Within 50, and the key point I want to make is that aligning capital with resilience and sustainability was absolutely fundamental in then delivering obliquely the basic human rights of life, livelihood and shelter. And by aligning and making society cognizant of the risk and capital, urban cities in the West were totally transformed within 50 years. Urban morphology was transformed, such that by 1920s, outside of warfare, urban fire, a mass urban fire, was history. That is the vision that we have to have with disaster, with natural hazard risk and the man-made disasters they produce. They are absolutely now foreseeable. Many of these events are actually forecastable. That has huge implications in fiduciary duties, duties of care, and just taking care. But if you want the analogy, go back to urban fire. Do a bit of Googling. It's exactly that spirit and that challenge and that alignment of interests that we need to recapture for this new challenge we face. And we're better to be the sharp end of the spear than resilient infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. This has been a fascinating set of panelists with their views. Before we go to the audience, I'd just like to point out a couple of things which we have not stressed on so far. One is, it's important to keep in mind that the risks today have changed in a foundational manner because of climate change. We have a huge amount of learning to do from past risks and how we could have and did respond to them. But a linear extrapolation to the present is risky because the kinds of disasters which are happening are both qualitatively and quantitatively different. One example about that, there's the Sagai antelope in Kazakhstan, which lives a high-risk life. Many of their offspring die, but tens of thousands suddenly died a couple of years ago. And the reason for that was found out last year, and that's because of a modest change in ambient temperature. A bacteria which normally stays on the nasal passages of the antelope invaded the blood system and killed a huge number of them instantly almost. So these kinds of modest changes can amplify into a population. Similarly, viruses and other diseases can spread in the population, can spread in agriculture in a manner which are amplifiability. So the amplifiability of risk, small risks amplifying through networks and actually exponentially growing as they spread, is something different qualitatively. These apply to other kinds of risks in the marine ecosystem and so on. So that's one very important point. Importantly, the science and technology to understand these new risks exist, and investment in fundamental research across the spectrum allows us to deal with unknown unknowns. Therefore, that must be scaled up. Coordination is needed to work on scale and implementation. Understanding must, as we've heard, be linked to the SDGs and to the development goals and to the environment. And global, national, and regional linkages are needed. And these must link with the economy and finance for resilience. That is a big challenge. Standards can be put in place, but finance ministries all over the world don't see the value immediately on a seat belt whose use may or may not happen soon. And therefore, convincing the value of seat belts to finance ministries and building that into a legal system is something very, very important. For this to happen, sensors and feedback at every level are needed, national, global, international, so that this becomes a part of our culture. There are enormous opportunities for innovation, entrepreneurship, and industry in contexts such as India. If you calculate the costs with all the bells and whistles and the legacy investments in the West, the cost for doing that in Latin America, in Asia, in countries such as India, in Africa, are going to be enormously large. So unless there is local capability in industry on scale, which has an economy and a value to the system in the context where it's embedded. We are going to try and import something which costs trillions of dollars into a system which is culturally not attuned to it, industrially not attuned to it, in terms of management not attuned to it, and therefore organic growth of the industries needed for disaster resilient infrastructure is also needed. Thank you. So we can take questions from the audience now. Yeah. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then the panelists can start answering them.
Thank you, sir. I'm Santosh Kumar from the National Institute of Disaster Management. I have just 2 questions in terms of building resilient infrastructure matrix. Like many of the initiatives taken by different countries in different point of time, especially on the post-disaster recovery, and the resilient infrastructure developed, what is the vehicle required to further scale it up to the different planning system process? That is important, maybe in the form of insurance and also in the form of coalition at the local level. And that coalition amongst the local government and also maybe within the local financial institutions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other related question, or maybe I can just ask Ron, would you like to address that? How does one bring in insurance and the link to local government and its policies together so that the growth of resilient infrastructure is manageable?
I think you're talking about insurance as risk protection, yeah, not insurance as investment. Well, here's something, and this ties back to why I was said to Kamal, insurance isn't an industry, it's an institution of society. So insurance is almost always bought because ultimately populations are encouraged or sometimes compelled to do so. So I buy insurance for my house in the UK because if I have a mortgage, my bank tells me that I have to insure my house to pay off the mortgage if something happens to the house. There are about 7 acts of Parliament in Britain that basically drive, I think, probably 70 or 80% of insurance demand. So ultimately, insurance, which is simply a mechanism for populations can share risk in 2 ways, through insurance premiums or through taxation. That's basically it. And it will be a choice of the government or public authorities to determine to what extent they want to encourage assets and infrastructure to be insured so that when they, well, 2 reasons. One, so when they're damaged or destroyed, they can be rebuilt, hopefully more strongly, and that is not a liability on the public purse. But actually often the agency of insurance actually has a powerful impact on helping to put a price on risk and drive resilience. I don't know if you picked it up, but it was a very important point that Dr. Singh made during his very eloquent speech earlier on, and he made it previously in November. The other key challenge in all countries is what responsibility for risk are you going to put at the local level, and how is risk then going to be elevated when things get more serious to a regional, national, and even global level. Now here again, I come back to the metric, and ultimately how's that financed? And one way or other, it's going to be through some sort of insurance system of some description. And here I come back to Andrew's points. If we have clear metrics which say to the infrastructure operator or owner, you are required to be resilient, as Alice taught me yesterday, performance-based metrics, you're required to be resilient to the maximum event or expected at a 1 in 50 year return period. Of course, that 1 in 50 will evolve with time, as we were just hearing, or the local authority is responsible for events up to a 1 in 25 year type of event. but when they get to a higher level, 1 in 50, the regional, provincial authority takes account. And then there will be some sort of national protection. We have to get to this level of accountability for risks, which, like in the way insurers think, are entirely foreseeable. And the key point is, going back to, I think Jim showed it, that these risks are about to have to be disclosed to financial regulators. This is coming down the track. Climate risk is going to be an input to credit risk. This means that entities, public and private, will have to hold these risks as contingent liabilities on an annualized basis, which gets exactly to Dr. VijayRaghavan's point, that once you have to account for this annually, the issues that these events happen only once every 10, 20, 50 years goes away. So ultimately, it's so much about the accounting and the governance which is going to drive the right sort of behaviors.
Thank you. Thank you, Rowan. Any other questions? Right at the back. And then you. There and then you. Yeah.
Thank you for giving time. I am Dr. Dayaram Sesta from Nepal. I work in Nepal government, Ministry of Home Affairs, before 7 years in disaster division. I wishing to success to the Iwdri 2019, and thank you for the host country and organizers to take part from Nepal side. I think that narrowing the disaster or the expanding the disaster. We are trying to mitigate the affection of the disaster, which is identified disaster like tsunami, earthquake, and hurricanes, etc. But affection of the new identified disaster is increasing. So we have to discuss how to mitigate and take defense making plans from this kind of new disaster like wildfire, thunderbolt, and man-made disaster. I think, is it the challenge for us, is it or not, I think. That's all.
So the question is that we have been used to certain kinds of disasters, earthquakes, landslides, tsunamis, and the standards for dealing with that are there. But there are many new emerging disasters which are unusual in specific contexts. How does one deal with that? I think that point was partly addressed by Junaid this morning about having a center of excellence knowledge network connected to implementation so that global knowledge can be shared in that. But any other comments from this? Jim?
Yeah, I think is that working? I think your question actually opens up the broader issue of how we cope with a very uncertain future. A future, not only are new types of hazard materializing, but there are a whole range of different changes underway, technological, political, societal, and behavioral. And I think part of that speaks to the framing of resilience, in that resilience is to do with being able to learn, to adapt to change, to cope with the unexpected. And so I think that plays back to the issues around knowledge, institutional strengthening, and as Junaid said at the start of today, community strengthening as well, which provides the capacity to cope with the unexpected.
Thank you. Over there, we have to finish soon. You had a question? Yeah. And I think that's, I should warn, is the last question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Kees van der Guchten, representing the government of the Netherlands here. From the presentations and the introduction so far on the content and intellectually, I think we can subscribe very much the good intentions of a coalition to address the wide field of infrastructure, disaster resilient infrastructure. Now, on the question whether a government could undersign a coalition, I still have some puzzles in my mind. I hear the word coalition. I also hear the word commission. Alliance has been mentioned. Is it meant to be a platform for knowledge exchange and learn from each other on all those different aspects? Or is it supposed to be also some kind of a broker towards the private sector involvement? Or is it supposed to reach out at the policy level? Should the country represent itself at the minister level or more at the knowledge-based level? How does it relate to maybe UN-based entities when it reaches out to political levels? I have many puzzles, and I hope to find out a bit more in the coming days, but maybe you can already reflect shortly on this.
Yeah, I think Kamal would be the best person to answer that.
Oh, now that's being on the spot. I think that's a good question, but I will say that in three parts. The first part is that this is something we still have to figure out. You know, I said earlier in the morning that we have to co-create the contours of it. So that's the first point. There is, you know, it can't, you know, we can't follow a philosophy where you decide that this is what it should be and try to fit some, you know, objectives around it. We have to determine the objectives and then decide what is the shape it takes. That's one. The second point is that, yes, I think the point talking about in terms of knowledge sharing, capacity development platform, that is essential. I think there is, it appears that there is a sort of need for that, and there is that gap that can be filled through some collaborative work. But the third point is that it doesn't have to be, you know, one or the other. It doesn't have to be knowledge or high-level policy engagement, as long as it aims to deliver something very specific, something very concrete. If it is a platform which is doing knowledge exchange for the sake of knowledge exchange, there isn't really a lot of value in it. It is very difficult to sustain something like that. But let me say, just, you know, aviation sector is something we'll discuss tomorrow. Let's say there are 5 countries that are the largest builders of airports in the world. They come together and then they begin to address the kinds of questions that Andrew was talking about. What is the kind of risk matrix we should have for our aviation infrastructure? Of course, no country would be under any obligation to adopt any global standard. But there is a forum where you can discuss, you can learn from each other, and voluntarily adopt something to build your own resilience. This is vitally important to do because in a number of infrastructure sectors, particularly relatively new infrastructure sectors, the pace at which we are building institutions to develop standards and enforce them is way behind the pace at which we are building infrastructure. You know, in India, in the last 10 years, we've built 500,000 mobile towers, you know, the cell phone towers. And there is no nationally accepted standard for that. There are general engineering standards. So what can we do in that space through a collaborative mechanism, learn from each other and, you know, adopt things for our benefit? So that's the third part of my answer to you, to identify specific focused areas that deliver tangible results and that actually help make things happen on the ground.
Thank you, Kamal. I've been told rather firmly that we must close this panel discussion. I think it's been very interesting and the questions could go on. So thank you very much to the audience and my fellow panelists, Andrew, Alice, Jim, and Rowan. Thank you all very much. And Kamal, of course.
Thank you, everyone. We will now move to the thematic session 1, Pillars Driving the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. This session has been divided into 3 simultaneous subsessions. The session T1A on risk assessment methodologies, risk metrics, and indicators of sustainability for different infrastructure classes will be chaired by Chengzi Mao from China Earthquake Administration and moderated by Andrew Maskrey from Risk Nexus Initiative. This session will have 5 speakers: Dr. Raghav Pant from the University of Oxford, Professor Ravi Sinha from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, Neil Olivare from Senepred, Peru, Ms. Mariela Barzada from Ministry of Finance, Peru, Professor Bilal Ayub from the University of Maryland will join us on video. This session will be held here in this hall. The subsession T1B on standards, design, and regulation for infrastructure development, operations, and maintenance will be chaired by Matthew Crossman, National Infrastructure Commission, UK, and moderated by Russell Meir from the World Bank Group. This session will have 5 speakers: Toshihiro Kamatani from MLIT, Japan, Dr. Sudhir Jain from Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar, Mark Johnson from International Code Council, Jimmy Scott from Queensland Reconstruction Authority, and Phil Rizkala from National Research Council, Canada. This session will be held at Diwan-e Khas, which is the room right behind this one. The session T1C on reconstruction and recovery planning of key infrastructure sectors after disasters will be chaired by Setsuko Saya, Cabinet Office, Japan, and moderated by Professor Mauro Dolce from Italy. This session will have 4 speakers: Dr. Joseph Littman from the World Bank Group, Rita Missel from UNDP, Diana Arlett from the National Disaster Prevention Center in Mexico City, and the representative from Saudi Arabia. This session will be held at Aftab Mehtab, which is outside the registration area to the left. I request all the chairs of the 3 groups to kindly wrap up their sessions by 1:15 p.m. so that we have a good 15-minute discussion before we break for lunch. I now request the chairs, moderators, and the speakers for T1B and T1C to please proceed to the designated halls. Other participants may choose to attend the session that interests them the most. Thank you.